In 2001, a couple stood at the edge of 3,500 acres of worn-out farmland in West Sussex, land one of their families had worked for more than 200 years, and made a decision their neighbors called madness. They stopped farming it. They pulled out every internal fence. They smashed the Victorian drainage pipes that had spent a century dragging water off the fields. They turned loose free-roaming herds of cattle, ponies, pigs, and deer. And then they did the single most unthinkable thing in British agriculture. They took their hands off the wheel entirely and let nature decide what the land should become. Then the surveys came in, and even the people who started the project hadn't dared imagine the numbers. Breeding birds up more than ninefold. Nightingales, one of Britain's most threatened songbirds, gone from a single territory to more than 60 singing males. Turtle doves, a bird that has crashed by something like 98% across the country, actually rising here, on what may be the only patch of land in Britain where that's true. Dragonflies and damselflies up by over 800%. One of the largest populations of purple emperor butterflies in the entire United Kingdom, with nearly 300 counted in a single day. And white storks nesting and breeding for the first time in Britain since the Middle Ages. A farm one of its owners called depleted, polluted, dysfunctional is now one of the most important wildlife sites in Britain. And hay race, the part that stops people cold. The method that produced all of this cost less than the farming it replaced. I'm Edmund Hale, and this is the full story of NEP, how financial desperation forced a 200-year-old family farm to give up on agriculture, the genuinely heretical scientific idea that gave them an alternative, and what the hard data now reveals about what happens when you put big animals back onto exhausted land and simply get out of their way. But to understand what NEP became, you have to understand what it was. Because the decision to stop farming wasn't idealism. It was a last resort. Charlie Burrell inherited the estate as a young man in the 1980s, a conventional dairy and arable farm. Wheat, barley, oats, maize, a herd of dairy cattle, all of it grinding away on heavy clay that never wanted to be farmland. The clay was cold, wet, and stubborn. Yields sat below the national average year after year. The farm didn't survive on profit, it survived on subsidies. And Burrell spent the better part of 15 years throwing everything at it. New machinery, new crop rotations, more aggressive drainage, trying to force a living out of ground that simply wouldn't give one. By the turn of the millennium, the estate was hemorrhaging money. Industrial farming on marginal English clay had hit a brick wall. But hay race, what makes NEP different from 1,000 other failed farms. Burrell and his wife, the writer Isabella Tree, didn't sell up. They didn't flog it to a developer or blanket it in commercial timber. They looked at land that was failing at the one job it had always been given, and asked a question almost nobody in British farming was asking. What would this land do if we stopped telling it what to be? The answer came from a piece of ecological theory that many scientists at the time considered close to heresy, the work of a Dutch ecologist named Franz Vera. The textbook view of European nature goes like this. Before humans started farming, lowland Europe was blanketed in dense, closed canopy forest. Take the humans away, and the trees simply take over again. Wilderness equals deep, dark woodland. Vera looked at that and said, no. He argued that prehistoric Europe was never one unbroken forest. It was a shifting mosaic, open grassland, scrub, thickets, and trees, all mixed together. And it was kept that way not by people, but by enormous herbivores. Wild oxen, wild horses, elk, deer, and boar roamed the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. Picture a giant animal shouldering through the trees, smashing a gap in the canopy where wildflowers rush in. They grazed, they browsed, they trampled, they rooted. They punched holes in the forest and kept the clearings open. And in doing so, they built a patchwork far richer in life than any uniform woodland could ever be. The animals, in other words, weren't just living in the landscape. They were building it. The theory was controversial. It still is. But Burrell and Tree saw in it something nobody had tested at scale in Britain.
Put the big herbivores back onto knackered farmland. Take down the fences. Undo the drainage. Stop managing the place. Let the animals shape the land instead of humans designing it. And see what actually happens. Theory is one thing. So they ran the experiment for real. And what emerged was a landscape no living person in southern England had ever seen. They chose the animals not for productivity, but for behavior.
Old English longhorn cattle. Hardy, slow-growing, happy to browse rough scrub rather than demand neat pasture. Exmoor ponies, one of the closest living stand-ins for the wild horses that once roamed Europe. Tamworth pigs, long snout and semi-feral, turned loose to do the soil churning, rooting work of wild boar, since you can't legally release boar in England, and several kinds of deer. Then every internal gate and fence came down, and the animals were free to go anywhere they liked, whenever they liked. And what they did was the opposite of what any farmer would predict. The cattle didn't crop the land into a tidy lawn. The ponies didn't mow it flat. The pigs didn't wreck the fields. Instead, each animal worked the land in its own way, and together they created what ecologists call habitat heterogeneity, a fancy phrase for gloriously, productively messy land. The pigs rooted up the soil with their snouts, leaving bare patches that pioneer plants and insects colonized within days. The cattle grazed selectively, leaving some areas long and some short. The ponies stripped back scrub the cattle wouldn't touch. The deer drifted through the emerging young woodland, stopping any single kind of vegetation from taking over. Within 5 years, the neat arable fields dissolved into a tangle of thickets, rough grassland, young woodland, and standing dead trees. A constantly shifting patchwork no human had drawn up on any plan. Isabella Tree called it a kaleidoscope, driven by animals not designed by people. And then the wildlife arrived. But the real shock wasn't that it came back. It was what came back and how fast. Take the nightingale, a bird in freefall across Britain. One that depends on exactly the kind of dense, thorny scrub modern farming systematically strips out. At Knepp, where bramble, blackthorn, and hawthorn were now allowed to sprawl unchecked across hundreds of acres, the nightingales exploded. From a single territory to more than 60 singing males. The very thickets the neighbors complained about, the scrubby weeds any conventional farmer would tear out, turned out to be, in Tree's words, rocket fuel for songbirds. And the same story repeated species after species. Turtle doves climbing at Knepp while they vanished everywhere else. Peregrine falcons breeding. Ravens returning. Red kites, sparrowhawks, skylarks, lesser spotted woodpeckers. Birds that had been absent or barely hanging on, setting up home. Erase the part that really matters. The data didn't just show a longer species list. It showed an entire ecosystem assembling itself, with no plan, no target list, nobody deciding what should live where. Driven by nothing more than the disturbance of free-roaming animals on tired farmland. The insects told their own astonishing story. The purple emperor, a large, iridescent, famously elusive butterfly most British naturalists count themselves lucky to glimpse once in a lifetime, turned up at Knepp in numbers that stunned entomologists. It breeds on sallow, a kind of willow, and sallow ran riot as the scrub spread. Knepp now holds one of the largest purple emperor populations in the country, with nearly 300 counted in a single day. Dragonflies and damselflies surged by over 800% once the old drainage broke up and water returned to the land naturally. And rare beetles that depend on dead and rotting wood, species not recorded in the area for decades, reappeared on the standing dead timber conventional forestry would have cleared away. But the headline act came on long legs. Knepp set out to deliberately bring back the white stork, a bird that hadn't bred in Britain since a pair nested on St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh in 1416. Roughly 6 centuries of absence. They established a group of non-flying storks in a safe enclosure to act as an anchor, a kind of social magnet to pull in the wild migratory storks that pass over southern England each spring. And it worked. The first wild pairs nested and bred successfully, the first white storks born in the British wild in 600 years. Within a few years, dozens of chicks were fledging. Young storks raised at Knepp began migrating to Spain, Morocco, and France, and some have since flown all the way back as adults, to breed at the very place they hatched, completing the migratory loop for the first time in living memory. And the transformation went deeper than anything you could see, right down into the soil. A major study found that Knepp's rewilded ground now locks away carbon at rates comparable to native woodland. Soil microbial life is dramatically higher than on the surrounding farmland. And the organic content of the soil, the foundation of fertility, of water retention, of everything, is climbing measurably in just 2 decades. In a country where most of the land is farmed and soil degradation is a genuine national crisis, that's not an academic curiosity. It's a proof of concept for every struggling farm on marginal ground. Which brings us to the surprise that demolishes the biggest myth about all of this. The conventional wisdom says rewilding is a luxury, a thing rich landowners do when they no longer need the land to pay. NEP proves the opposite. The estate now earns money from streams that simply didn't exist under farming. Wild range, pasture-fed meat from the free-roaming herds. Safari-style ecotourism. Camping and guided wildlife walks pulling in tens of thousands of visitors a year. Biodiversity credits sold to developers to offset their impact elsewhere. In effect, getting paid to keep land wild. And carbon from those rewilded soils. Stop and think about that for a second. The wild version makes more money than the farm ever did, and employs more people in more varied jobs than the old dairy and arable operation ever could. Letting nature take over didn't just save the wildlife. It saved the business. And there's a detail I love that ties the whole thing together. Just south of the estate sits a village whose name is essentially a fossil. It comes from an old Saxon phrase meaning, roughly, the village of the storks. For 600 years, that name described a bird nobody living there had ever seen. The storks were gone. Only the word remained. And now white storks circle on the thermals above NEP's ancient oaks, clashing their bills on nests built in the same kind of trees where medieval storks once raised their young. The village that carries the stork's name in its very identity can watch the bird from its doorstep again. The word has its meaning back. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. 3,500 acres. A decision made out of pure financial desperation by a couple who couldn't make their farm pay. Cattle, ponies, pigs, and deer turned loose on exhausted clay, with no targets, no species list, no management plan beyond let the animals create the landscape. And the result, one of the most important wildlife sites in Britain. Built not by conservationists with a blueprint, but by the animals themselves, doing exactly what big herbivores have done across Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. And that's the lesson I think reaches far beyond one estate in Sussex. We've spent a long time assuming that healing nature means managing it harder. More control, more intervention, more careful human hands keeping everything in order. NEP made the opposite bet, and it paid off spectacularly. It suggests that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for a piece of land is to stop fighting it, return the animals that evolved to shape it, and have the humility to step back and let them work. Nobody designed what NEP became. They just stopped getting in the way. And an exhausted farm came roaring back to life. If the story moved you the way it moves me, tell me one thing in the comments. Do you think more of our worn-out farmland should be handed back to nature like this? If it changed how you picture what a healthy landscape really looks like, share it with someone who'd appreciate it. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you'd ever believe, and I've got plenty more to tell you. I'm Edmund Hale. Thanks for watching.